ghosts, legends, and the haunting of memory. When buildings remember. Long after the patients leave. Long after the doors are locked. And long after the corridors fall silent. The stories refuse to disappear. Across Britain, the ruins of former psychiatric asylums have become something unusual. They are not simply historical sites. They are not merely abandoned buildings. In the public imagination, they have become haunted places. Places whispered about in paranormal forums. Explored in the middle of the night by thrill seekers. Featured in ghost hunting television programs. Shared in online videos that claim to capture unexplained voices echoing through empty wards. The idea of haunted asylums is now deeply embedded in modern culture. To many people, it feels almost inevitable. A building that once contained thousands of human tragedies. Surely it must contain something more. A presence. An echo. A memory that refuses to fade. But the real story of haunted asylums is more complicated than ghost stories. Because the fear people feel when standing inside these buildings may not come from the supernatural at all. It may come from something far more unsettling. The realization that these places were once full of real people. Whose suffering was very real. And whose lives unfolded behind walls that society largely ignored. 1. Why abandoned asylums attract ghost stories. Ghost stories rarely emerge randomly. They often appear in places where human suffering once concentrated. Battlefields. Prisons. Hospitals. And perhaps most powerfully of all, mental asylums. The reason may lie less in the supernatural, and more in the psychology of memory. When people encounter locations associated with intense emotional experiences, grief, fear, despair, isolation, the human imagination begins filling the silence with meaning. Abandoned asylums possess all the elements that feed this process. First, there is the architecture. Victorian psychiatric institutions were built on a massive scale. Long corridors stretch into the distance. High ceilings amplify echoes. Iron staircases creak with every movement. Large windows allow pale light to spill across cracked floors. Even in daylight, these buildings can feel oppressive. At night, they become something else entirely. The mind begins to interpret every sound as something deliberate. Every shadow as movement. Every creak as footsteps. Then there is the history. Visitors know that thousands of people once lived inside these walls. Many experienced profound psychological suffering. Some died here. Some were buried on the grounds. Some were forgotten by their families and by society. Knowing this history changes how people perceive the space. The building no longer feels empty. It feels watched. Not because something supernatural is necessarily present, but because the past feels emotionally close. The building becomes a container for memory. And memory, when surrounded by silence and darkness, easily transforms into ghost stories. 2. The role of silence. Silence plays a powerful role in shaping how people experience abandoned places. When asylums were active institutions, they were full of noise. Footsteps in hallways. Doors opening and closing. Patients talking, shouting, crying. Attendants moving equipment. Doctors making rounds. Meals being served. Metal beds shifting against the floor. But when an asylum closes, all of that noise disappears. The silence that replaces it can feel unnatural. Rooms that once held dozens of people now sit completely empty. Large wards echo with nothing but wind slipping through broken windows. Even the smallest sound, a loose pipe, a falling piece of plaster, the distant call of a bird, can feel amplified. The mind, accustomed to interpreting noise as meaning, begins searching for explanations. And in that quiet, the imagination becomes active. A distant creak becomes footsteps. A shifting shadow becomes movement. A faint echo becomes a voice. Ghost stories often begin this way. Not through evidence of spirits, but through the powerful human instinct to interpret silence as something waiting to be understood. 3. Urban explorers and the modern discovery of asylum ruins. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a new group of people began rediscovering abandoned asylums. Urban explorers. Often called urbex enthusiasts, these individuals seek out forgotten structures and document them before they disappear. Old factories. Abandoned hospitals. Derelict schools. And perhaps most famously, former psychiatric institutions. Urban explorers are often drawn to asylums for their scale and atmosphere. These buildings can be enormous. Entire complexes containing dozens of structures. Administrative buildings. Dormitory wards. Operating theaters. Laundry facilities. Kitchens. Chapels. Water towers. Underground tunnels. Walking through one can feel like exploring a lost city. Inside these ruins, explorers sometimes find remnants of the past that make the experience deeply unsettling. Rusting hospital beds still lined up in rows. Wheelchairs sitting motionless in empty hallways. Medical cabinets containing old bottles and instruments. Filing rooms filled with forgotten patient documents. Blackboards in therapy rooms with faint writing still visible. Chapel pews covered in dust. These objects create a powerful sense that the building was abandoned suddenly. That human lives once unfolded here in ways now impossible to fully understand. And it is within these spaces that many ghost legends begin to grow. 4. The iconic images of haunted asylums. Over time, certain images have become almost symbolic of haunted asylums. A single wheelchair sitting alone in a corridor. A rusted hospital bed frame beneath peeling paint. Rows of cracked porcelain sinks in long-abandoned washrooms. Long hallways illuminated only by narrow beams of light. These visuals appear again and again in photographs shared online. In documentaries. In ghost hunting television shows. And in viral videos posted by urban explorers. Each image tells a story without words. It invites viewers to imagine the lives once lived there. The patients who slept in those beds. The attendants who pushed those wheelchairs. The quiet moments that unfolded in those rooms. The absence of people becomes as powerful as their presence once was. And in that absence, the imagination fills the gap. The building begins to feel inhabited not by ghosts, but by memories. 5. Underground tunnels and hidden spaces. Many historic asylums contained networks of underground tunnels. These passageways connected different buildings across large institutional grounds. They allowed staff to move supplies between kitchens, laundries, and wards without exposure to harsh weather. They carried pipes for heating systems and electrical cables. They served practical functions. But in abandoned buildings, tunnels acquire a different reputation. Dark. Narrow. Silent. Sometimes partially flooded or filled with debris. Urban explorers who venture into these spaces often describe an overwhelming sense of unease. Flashlights reveal endless stretches of brick corridors disappearing into darkness. Water drips from pipes overhead. Footsteps echo in ways that distort direction and distance. In such environments, even experienced explorers can feel disoriented. Stories begin to circulate. Unexplained footsteps. Cold spots. Strange echoes resembling voices. Whether these experiences have natural explanations or not, they contribute to the mythology of haunted asylums. The tunnels become symbolic passageways between past and present. Places where the imagination easily crosses into the realm of legend. 6. The paranormal industry. In recent decades, paranormal investigation has become a form of entertainment. Television programs send ghost hunters into abandoned buildings. Participants carry recording devices designed to capture unexplained sounds. They use thermal cameras to detect temperature changes. They ask questions into empty rooms and wait for responses. Former asylums have become some of the most popular locations for these investigations. The reasons are obvious. Their history is emotionally charged. Their architecture creates dramatic visual settings. Their silence invites suspense. For viewers, these investigations can be thrilling. The possibility that something unseen might respond adds tension. But this phenomenon raises an important question. When ghost hunters enter these spaces searching for supernatural evidence, what exactly are they engaging with? Are they exploring history? Or transforming real human suffering into spectacle? 7. The ethical question. The haunted reputation of asylums creates an uncomfortable ethical dilemma. On one hand, ghost stories keep these places alive in public memory. They remind people that something significant once occurred there. They draw attention to buildings that might otherwise be forgotten or demolished. On the other hand, these stories can sometimes reduce complex human histories to entertainment. The patients who lived in these institutions were real people. Many endured loneliness, fear, or misunderstanding. Some were confined unjustly. Some died anonymously within the institution. Turning their lives into ghost legends risks simplifying those experiences. Instead of remembering individuals as human beings, the narrative can shift toward mysterious spirits haunting corridors. The tragedy becomes a spectacle. The suffering becomes atmosphere. This tension continues to shape how society remembers the asylum era. Are we honoring the past? Or sensationalizing it? 8. The real haunting. Perhaps the most unsettling truth about abandoned asylums is this. The real haunting may not involve ghosts at all. The true haunting may be historical awareness. When people stand inside these buildings, they confront an uncomfortable reality. For more than a century, societies across Britain believed that the best solution to mental illness was institutional isolation. Thousands of people were removed from their communities. Many never returned. This system was not hidden. It was widely accepted, respected, even celebrated as humane reform. The unsettling question arises. If society once accepted such systems as normal, what other systems might we accept today without fully questioning them? The ruins of asylums do not merely remind us of past suffering. They challenge us to reflect on our present assumptions. And that realization can feel more unsettling than any ghost story. Memory that refuses to fade. Today, many former asylum sites have been redeveloped. Some are now apartments. Some are hospitals. Some have been demolished entirely. But others still stand. Silent. Weathered. Watching as decades pass. Inside their walls once unfolded countless human stories. Stories of despair. Stories of resilience. Stories of people struggling to understand minds that society feared and misunderstood. The ghost stories that surround these buildings may never disappear. But perhaps the true purpose of these legends is not to frighten us. Perhaps they exist because people instinctively feel that something important happened here. Something that should not be forgotten. The corridors may be empty now. The wards silent. The gates unlocked. But the memory of the asylum era still lingers in the cultural imagination. Not as a supernatural haunting, but as a historical one. A reminder that institutions, once built with confidence and certainty, can one day stand abandoned. Leaving future generations to walk through their ruins. Asking how such places once seemed necessary. And wondering whether we have truly learned from their legacy. Case Study Storytelling segment. From Systems to Lives. Throughout this documentary, we have explored the history of British asylums through policies, institutions, and social systems. We have examined laws, medical theories, architectures of confinement, institutional routines, and the rise and fall of a system that once housed tens of thousands of people. But large systems can hide something important. Individual lives. Behind every statistic was a human being. A person with a family. A past. A voice that may or may not have been heard. The archives of asylum history contain fragments of these lives. Admission records. Doctors' notes. Letters sent to families. Petitions asking for release. Small details that reveal something deeply human beneath the institutional language. Tonight, we move away from the large view of history and step closer to the personal. The following stories are inspired by real patterns found throughout asylum archives. They represent the kinds of lives that passed through these institutions. Lives that unfolded quietly, often without witnesses, and sometimes without anyone left to remember them. Story A: The Young Mother. It begins with a marriage. A modest one. A small home in an industrial town somewhere in 19th century Britain. The young woman at the center of this story might have been 23 years old. Perhaps 24. She had recently given birth to her first child. Childbirth in that era was dangerous, exhausting, and emotionally overwhelming. There was little understanding of postpartum mental illness. When the baby arrived, the household should have been filled with celebration. Instead, something began to change. The young mother stopped sleeping. Her thoughts raced. She cried suddenly and without clear reason. Sometimes she laughed when nothing was funny. Other times she stared silently into space for long periods. Her husband did not understand what was happening. Neither did her neighbors. Her behavior grew more unpredictable. One night she shouted that someone was standing in the corner of the room. Another day she insisted that the baby had been replaced with another child. Fear spread through the household. Was she ill? Possessed? Dangerous? In that era, mental distress after childbirth was poorly understood. Postpartum psychosis existed, but it had no clear name within ordinary life. What people saw instead was instability. And instability frightened them. Eventually a doctor was called. He asked a few questions, observed her agitation, noted her sleeplessness, her confusion, her emotional volatility. Within days, the decision was made. She would be admitted to the asylum. Her arrival. The journey to the institution may have taken hours. Perhaps by carriage. Perhaps by train. The young woman likely did not fully understand what was happening. Some patients believed they were simply visiting a hospital. Others suspected the truth and resisted. When she arrived, attendants guided her through large iron gates. Inside stood a massive building surrounded by open land. High windows. Long wings stretching outward like arms. She was taken into an admission room. A clerk recorded her name, her age, her marital status, her supposed diagnosis. A brief description might have appeared in the records. Excited, disturbed, delusional following childbirth. Her belongings were removed. Personal clothing replaced with institutional garments. The baby remained at home. Inside the asylum, the young mother entered a world of unfamiliar routines. Morning bells. Ward inspections. Meals served at strict hours. Nurses watching constantly. At first she might have cried often. Asked to see her child. Asked to go home. But the institution had its own rhythm. Days passed. Weeks passed. Letters from family may have arrived, or perhaps they did not. Over time, her protests might have softened. Her voice quieter. Her requests less frequent. In some cases, postpartum psychosis can resolve within months. But recovery inside an institution did not always guarantee release. Doctors evaluated patients cautiously. A woman who had once seemed unstable might still be considered risky. And so sometimes, months quietly became years. Story B: The Laborer. The second story begins not in a household, but in the factories. Picture an industrial town during the height of Britain's manufacturing era. The air smells of coal smoke. Machines roar inside long brick buildings. Men and women work exhausting shifts under harsh conditions. Our next subject is a laborer. A man perhaps in his 30s. His life had never been easy. Long hours. Uncertain wages. Little protection from illness or injury. He had a wife. Perhaps 2 children. Their lives depended entirely on his ability to work. Then tragedy struck. Industrial towns were dangerous places. Accidents were common. Disease spread easily in crowded housing. One winter, illness swept through the neighborhood. Within weeks, the laborer's youngest child died. Grief entered the household like a shadow. But grief did not stop the factory whistle. Work continued. Bills continued. Food still had to be bought. The man returned to his job. But something inside him had changed. He began drinking heavily. At first it was an escape. A way to quiet the sorrow. But alcohol gradually deepened his despair. He grew volatile. Sometimes shouting. Sometimes weeping. Neighbors heard arguments from the house. One evening, witnesses saw him in the street shouting incoherently, crying that the world had become meaningless. Police were called. In the Victorian legal system, public breakdown could be interpreted as evidence of insanity. Within days, the laborer was evaluated. A certificate of insanity was signed. And he too entered the asylum. Life inside the institution. Unlike the young mother, this man might have been assigned to work. Many asylums relied on patient labor. Farms needed tending. Gardens required maintenance. Workshops produced clothing, furniture, and repairs. Patients were often expected to contribute. Doctors believed structured labor might restore stability. For some individuals, this work provided routine and purpose. For others, it simply resembled another form of confinement. The laborer might have spent long days digging soil or repairing tools. His grief slowly buried beneath physical exhaustion. But alcoholism and depression can leave lasting marks. Years passed. He became quieter, less expressive. Doctors might eventually label him a chronic patient, a term that carried enormous consequences. Because once a patient received that label, release became less likely. And so the laborer who once supported a family through factory work might spend the rest of his life tending fields within the walls of an asylum. Story C. The Child. The third story begins in childhood. A boy perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He struggled in school. Reading came slowly. Writing even slower. Teachers complained that he could not keep pace with other students. At home, his family faced poverty. His parents worked long hours simply to survive. They had little time to supervise his education. Over time, teachers began using a label that appeared frequently in 19th century records. Defective. The term carried broad meanings. It could refer to developmental disabilities, learning differences, speech impairments, or simply a child who failed to meet academic expectations. In an era with limited educational support, such children were often viewed as burdens. Eventually, local authorities intervened. The boy was removed from ordinary schooling, transferred to an institution designed to house mentally deficient youth. At first, the environment may have resembled a school. Dormitories, classrooms, supervised activities. But the future awaiting such children was uncertain. Many institutions provided only basic training, simple tasks, repetitive work. Expectations were low. And once institutionalized, children often remained within the system for years. Adolescence arrived. Then adulthood. But opportunities rarely expanded. Without education, family support, or employment prospects, some remained within institutional care indefinitely. The boy who struggled with reading at age 9 might reach 40 years old without ever experiencing independent life. His childhood mistake quietly defining the rest of his existence. Story D: The Elderly Widow. The final story belongs to an older generation. An elderly widow, perhaps in her 70s. Her husband had died years earlier. Her children lived far away. Age brought new difficulties. Memory began slipping. At first it was small things. Misplacing household objects. Forgetting familiar names. Then the confusion deepened. She wandered outside late at night. Neighbors found her asking strange questions. She sometimes failed to recognize people she had known for decades. Today we would recognize these symptoms as dementia. But in earlier centuries, such conditions were poorly understood. Families often struggled to care for elderly relatives experiencing cognitive decline. Eventually someone contacted authorities. A doctor examined her briefly. Recorded disorientation, confusion, erratic behavior. His conclusion might have been simple: senile insanity. With that diagnosis, the elderly widow entered the asylum. Inside, she joined many other aging patients. Some wandered the wards aimlessly. Others sat silently in communal rooms. Nurses supervised them as best they could. But large institutions were not designed for personalized dementia care. Her world gradually became smaller. Familiar faces disappeared. Memories faded. The corridors became confusing mazes. And one day, quietly, she died in the ward. Her burial likely took place in the institution's cemetery. A simple grave. Perhaps unmarked. Another life passing into the silent records of asylum history. Remembering the individuals. These stories represent only a few possibilities among thousands. The young mother. The grieving laborer. The struggling child. The elderly widow. Their experiences differed. Their circumstances unique. Yet all of them shared one moment that changed everything. Crossing the threshold of an asylum. For some patients, institutions offered safety during crisis. For others, they became places where life quietly disappeared. History often remembers systems and institutions. But the true story of the asylum era is written in individual lives. Lives shaped by the medical knowledge, fears, and social values of their time. Lives that remind us that mental illness is never merely a diagnosis. It is a human experience. And every person who passed through those gates carried a story that deserved to be heard. Even if history recorded it only in fragments. Even if the world outside eventually forgot their names. Because behind every asylum wall, there were not just patients. There were people. And their stories still echo in the history we are only beginning to understand. What the records don't tell. The silence inside the archives. History often presents itself as a collection of documents. Files. Registers. Letters. Official reports carefully preserved in archives. When historians attempt to understand the story of psychiatric asylums, these records become the starting point. Shelves filled with admission books. Boxes of medical reports. Folders containing case notes written in fading ink. Each page appears to offer a glimpse into the past. A name. A diagnosis. A date of admission. A brief description of behavior. Perhaps a note about improvement. Or decline. Or death. But the deeper researchers look into these records, the more they discover something unsettling. For every document that survives, many others have vanished. And even those that remain often reveal less than they seem. Because the official archive is not a neutral mirror of the past. It is a filtered record. A narrative shaped by those who held authority inside the institution. And the people who possessed the least power inside the asylum. The patients themselves are often the ones whose voices are hardest to hear. 1. The gaps in the archive. The first challenge historians face is the sheer number of missing records. Over the long history of British psychiatric institutions, millions of documents were created. Admission files, medical charts, correspondence between doctors and families, inspection reports. But time is rarely kind to paper. Many records were destroyed deliberately. Others were lost through neglect. Some burned in fires. Others discarded when institutions closed. Even when files survive, they are often incomplete. A patient's admission may be documented in careful detail, but their later life inside the asylum might appear only in scattered notes. Months or years of experience compressed into a single sentence. Patient remains quiet. Or, no change in condition. Behind those brief lines might lie entire years of lived experience. Friendships, conflicts, moments of despair, moments of hope. But the records rarely capture such details. Instead, they offer only fragments. And the gaps between those fragments can be enormous. 2. The perspective of authority. Another limitation of asylum archives is perspective. Nearly all institutional records were written by staff. Doctors, clerks, inspectors, administrators. These individuals documented what they considered medically or administratively important. Symptoms, behavior, compliance, treatment outcomes. But their perspective shaped how patients were described. A person shouting in distress might be recorded as agitated. Someone refusing medication might be labeled uncooperative. A patient pleading for release might be described simply as persistent in delusional beliefs. These phrases carry the authority of medical language. But they do not necessarily capture the emotional reality of the patient. They describe behavior from the outside, not the inner experience. In this way, the archive becomes dominated by the voices of those who observed the patients, rather than those who lived the experience themselves. And over time, that imbalance shapes how history is remembered. 3. The silence of the patients. The voices of patients are present in the archive, but often only indirectly. Some patients wrote letters. Letters to their families. Letters to local officials. Letters pleading for release. Letters describing conditions inside the institution. But many of these letters never reached their intended recipients. Institutional rules often allowed staff to censor correspondence. Letters considered evidence of delusion or agitation might be withheld. Others were destroyed. Even when letters survive, they sometimes appear only as copies attached to medical records, filtered through the judgment of staff who decided whether the patient's words were meaningful or merely symptomatic. In many cases, patient testimony was translated into diagnostic language. A person describing fear might be recorded as paranoid. Someone expressing grief might be labeled melancholic. A protest against confinement might become evidence of lack of insight. Over time, the emotional complexity of human suffering became compressed into medical terminology, and the original voice of the patient faded behind clinical interpretation. For translating suffering into diagnosis. Psychiatric medicine has always attempted to interpret human behavior through categories. Diagnosis offers a way to organize symptoms, to identify patterns, to guide treatment. But diagnosis also simplifies experience. A person's entire emotional world may be reduced to a single word. Mania, melancholia, hysteria, schizophrenia. These labels serve medical purposes. Yet they can also obscure individuality. Two patients with the same diagnosis may have entirely different life stories, different traumas, different fears, different hopes. Inside the asylum archive, those differences often disappear. The record may list dozens of patients with identical diagnoses, but their inner lives remain invisible. We know they existed. We know they suffered, but the details of their personal experience remain largely unknown. 5. The limits of historical reconstruction. Because of these gaps and biases, historians face a difficult reality. It is impossible to fully reconstruct what every patient experienced. We cannot hear every conversation that occurred inside the wards. We cannot know every private thought that passed through the minds of those confined. We cannot fully understand the emotional reality of someone who spent decades inside an institution. The archive gives us clues, patterns, occasional glimpses, but it cannot restore every lost voice. Recognizing this limitation is not a failure of history. It is a form of humility, an acknowledgement that the past is always larger than the documents that survive, and that the lives of many patients were more complex than any official record could capture. 6. What the patterns reveal. Even with these limitations, the historical patterns are unmistakable. Large numbers of people were confined for long periods. Many entered institutions during moments of crisis. Some recovered and left. Others remained for decades. Women were sometimes institutionalized during periods of emotional distress following childbirth. Men struggling with trauma, poverty, or addiction appeared frequently in admission records. Children labeled as intellectually disabled were often placed in lifelong institutional systems. Elderly individuals experiencing dementia sometimes spent their final years inside psychiatric wards. These patterns reveal something profound about the society that created the asylum system. Mental illness was not merely a medical issue. It was deeply connected to social conditions. Poverty, gender expectations, family structures, economic hardship, and cultural fears about behavior that deviated from accepted norms. The Asylum Archive therefore tells a story not only about patients, but about the society that confined them. 7. Why this history still matters. At first glance, the asylum era might seem distant. Most of the large psychiatric institutions have now closed, their buildings repurposed or demolished. Modern mental health care looks very different from the systems that dominated the 19th century. But history is never completely separate from the present. Attitudes toward mental illness evolve slowly. Stigma can persist across generations. Misunderstandings about psychological suffering still shape how societies respond to those in distress. The story of the asylum system reminds us that institutions once believed to be compassionate solutions can gradually become harmful. It reminds us how easily vulnerable people can lose their voice when systems speak on their behalf. And it reminds us that the line between care and control is often fragile. The past does not simply disappear. It leaves traces in the values and assumptions that continue to shape modern societies. Listening for the missing voices. If you visit an archive today and open an asylum record from the 19th century, you may see only a few lines written in careful handwriting. A name, a diagnosis, a date of admission, a brief description of behavior, perhaps a final note indicating discharge, transfer, or death. But behind those few lines once existed an entire human life. A childhood, a family, a network of relationships, dreams that may never have been recorded, fears that were never written down, moments of hope that disappeared from the official record. The archives of psychiatric history therefore ask us to do something unusual. To read not only what is written, but also what is missing. To remember that the quietest voices in the archive may represent the people who endured the most. And to recognize that every patient who passed through the asylum gates carried a story far larger than the pages that attempted to document it. Because the true history of these institutions is not contained entirely in files and reports. It lives in the lives that once unfolded inside their walls. Lives that history is still trying to hear. The moral reckoning. Judging the past. When modern audiences look back at the history of psychiatric asylums, the reaction is often immediate. Shock. Discomfort. Sometimes anger. Images of overcrowded wards, locked doors, restraint devices, and forgotten patients create a powerful impression that these institutions were simply cruel places. From the perspective of the 21st century, it can be tempting to deliver a simple verdict. To declare that the asylum system was nothing more than a dark chapter in medical history. But history rarely offers such easy conclusions. The reality of the asylum era is more complicated than a simple story of villains and victims. Within those vast institutions were thousands of people, doctors, nurses, attendants, families, and patients, all living within the beliefs and limitations of their time. Some individuals truly believed they were building a humane system. Some reforms were introduced with genuine compassion. Some patients did receive care, safety, and relief from conditions that might otherwise have destroyed them. The moral reckoning of the asylum era therefore requires something difficult. Not quick condemnation, but careful reflection. An effort to understand how a system that began with humanitarian ambitions could gradually produce so much suffering. 1. Were all asylums evil? It is important to begin with an uncomfortable truth. Not every asylum experience was abusive. Not every doctor was cruel. Not every institution functioned as a place of neglect. Some early reformers who advocated for the creation of asylums were motivated by genuine concern. Before the rise of psychiatric hospitals, people experiencing severe mental illness were often treated far worse. They might be imprisoned, hidden by families, confined in poorhouses, or left wandering the streets without care. To 19th century reformers, the asylum represented progress. A specialized institution where people suffering mental distress could receive protection, shelter, and treatment. Some doctors genuinely attempted to improve conditions. They introduced gardens where patients could walk, organized social activities, music, crafts, and reading rooms. They experimented with therapies that emphasized calm environments and structured routines. Many nurses and attendants worked long hours under extremely difficult conditions. Some formed real bonds with the patients they cared for. They offered kindness in a system that was often strained beyond its limits. There are records of patients who did recover. People who entered the asylum during periods of crisis, received care, and eventually returned to their communities. These stories remind us that the asylum system cannot be reduced to a single narrative. It contained moments of compassion alongside moments of cruelty, hope alongside despair, and individuals whose intentions were often far more humane than the systems surrounding them. 2. When systems outgrow their ideals. Yet even when many individuals acted with good intentions, the system itself contained deep structural dangers. The scale of the asylum network grew rapidly. Institutions designed for hundreds of patients began housing thousands. Overcrowding transformed environments that were once intended to be therapeutic. Staff who might have wanted to provide attentive care found themselves responsible for far too many patients. Medical supervision became stretched. Individual treatment became difficult. Routine replaced personal attention. The architecture of the asylum itself encouraged separation. Patients lived behind walls. Visitors were limited. The public rarely saw what occurred inside. Over time, these institutions became closed worlds. And closed systems carry an inherent risk. Power begins to concentrate. Decisions made by a small number of authorities shape the lives of thousands. Without strong external oversight, harmful practices can develop gradually. Not necessarily through deliberate cruelty, but through habit, efficiency, institutional routine. Small compromises repeated over years, until the original humanitarian vision becomes difficult to recognize. 3. Power without enough accountability. One of the most dangerous features of the asylum system was the imbalance of power. Doctors and administrators controlled nearly every aspect of institutional life. They determined diagnoses, approved treatments, decided when patients could be discharged, and recorded the official narratives that entered the archive. Patients, by contrast, had very limited authority. If they protested confinement, their protest might be interpreted as evidence of illness. If they resisted treatment, resistance might reinforce the diagnosis. If they complained about conditions, their credibility could be questioned. This dynamic created a troubling paradox. The individuals most affected by the institution had the least ability to challenge it. And because mental illness was often associated with irrationality in the public imagination, patient testimony could be easily dismissed. In such environments, accountability becomes fragile. Even compassionate professionals can become part of systems that gradually silence those they intend to help. When medicine blends with moral judgment. Another complexity of the asylum era lies in the relationship between medicine and morality. Psychiatry did not exist in isolation from social values. Doctors lived within the same cultural beliefs as the communities around them. Ideas about proper behavior, gender roles, respectability, self-control. These social expectations sometimes influenced how mental illness was defined. A woman expressing emotional distress might be described as hysterical. A man struggling with alcoholism might be diagnosed with moral weakness. People whose behavior deviated from social norms could be interpreted through a medical lens. In some cases, this meant that genuine suffering received care. But in other cases, social difference was mistaken for pathology. Unusual beliefs, rebellious behavior, extreme grief, political dissent, or simply nonconformity. When medicine merges too closely with cultural judgment, the boundary between treatment and control becomes blurred. The asylum system occasionally crossed that boundary, turning institutions meant for healing into mechanisms that enforce social order. 5. Poverty and pathology. Economic hardship also played a powerful role in the story of psychiatric confinement. The 19th and early 20th centuries were periods of enormous social inequality. Industrial workers lived under harsh conditions. Families often lacked resources to care for relatives experiencing severe mental distress. For poor households, the asylum sometimes became the only available option. Admission records reveal how frequently poverty appears alongside psychiatric diagnoses. People exhausted by overwork. Parents unable to support disabled children. Widows left without income. Men struggling with trauma and alcoholism after years of physical labor. In such cases, the line between medical need and social failure becomes difficult to separate. The asylum functioned not only as a hospital, but also as a social safety valve. A place where society placed individuals who could not easily survive within existing economic structures. This reality raises uncomfortable questions about how societies define illness, and how often social problems become medicalized when no other solutions seem available. 6. Difference treated as disorder. Throughout the history of psychiatry, definitions of mental illness have evolved. Conditions once considered disorders are sometimes reinterpreted as normal variations of human experience. Behaviors once feared are later understood in new ways. During the asylum era, many individuals were confined because their behavior made others uncomfortable. Some experienced genuine psychological crises, but others may have simply lived outside social expectations. A woman refusing traditional domestic roles. A man speaking unconventional religious beliefs. A person whose emotional expression seemed too intense for their community. Over time, psychiatric science has learned to distinguish more carefully between illness and individuality. But the asylum era reminds us how easily societies can mistake difference for disorder, and how powerful institutions can enforce those judgments. 7. The national memory. Across Britain, the scale of the asylum system was enormous. Dozens of large institutions operated simultaneously. Some housed thousands of patients at their peak. Entire landscapes were shaped by their presence. From rural counties to urban outskirts, these buildings stood as physical symbols of society's attempt to manage mental illness. Their construction required vast public investment. Their operation employed large numbers of staff. Their existence reflected national attitudes toward vulnerability, responsibility, and social order. Today, many of these institutions have disappeared. Their buildings converted into apartments. Their grounds redeveloped. Their wards demolished. But their legacy remains embedded in national memory. The asylum system reflects more than medical history. It reflects the fears, values, and limitations of the society that built it. Fear of madness. Fear of social instability. Concern for public safety. And an evolving attempt to balance compassion with control. Learning without forgetting. The moral reckoning of the asylum era does not end with condemnation. Nor does it end with nostalgia for institutions that once promised order and care. Instead, it invites reflection. A recognition that societies often build systems with sincere intentions. Yet those systems can evolve in unexpected ways. The story of the asylum reminds us how easily compassion can become bureaucracy. How medical authority can drift toward control. And how vulnerable individuals can lose their voice within large institutions. But history also offers another lesson. Progress is possible. Attitudes change. Medical understanding grows. And societies gradually learn from past mistakes. The ruins of the old asylum stand not only as reminders of suffering, but as reminders of responsibility. A responsibility to continue questioning how we treat those who struggle with mental illness. To ensure that care remains humane. That dignity remains central. And that compassion never disappears beneath the weight of institutional power. Because the true measure of a society is not how it treats the strong, but how it treats those who are most vulnerable. And the story of the asylum era asks us a final question. Have we truly learned the lessons it left behind? Or are those lessons still waiting for us to understand them? Final chilling conclusion. The building at night. Night falls slowly over the abandoned asylum. The last traces of daylight fade behind the horizon. And shadows begin to stretch across the empty grounds. The building stands exactly as it has for decades. Silent. Motionless. Watching. Wind moves through broken windows, slipping past cracked frames and shattered glass. It travels down long corridors, where footsteps once echoed from dawn until dusk. Now there is only air. Cold. Restless. Unanswered. Inside, the wards remain frozen in time. Rows of rusted bed frames sit where they were left. Paint peels from the walls in long, curling strips. Doors hang slightly open, as if someone passed through them long ago and never returned. The locks no longer function. The keys are gone. And yet, the rooms still feel closed, sealed in a way that has nothing to do with metal or hinges. Something about the space resists being fully entered, as though the past has not entirely released its hold. The weight of what remains. It is easy to stand in a place like this and imagine ghosts. To picture figures moving through the darkness. To listen for whispers in the silence. To feel that something unseen might still linger here. But the true weight of this building does not come from what might be present. It comes from what we know was once here. Thousands of lives. Contained within walls that were built with purpose. Maintained with certainty. Operated with the belief that they were necessary. Every corridor once carried human movement. Every room once held someone's story. Moments of fear. Moments of confusion. Moments of quiet endurance. All unfolding behind doors that separated the inside from the outside world. And now, all of it is gone. Or at least, it appears to be. The illusion of distance. There is a temptation to believe that this history belongs entirely to the past. That these buildings represent something distant. Something outdated. Something that no longer reflects the present. But the truth is less comfortable. The asylum system did not emerge from cruelty alone. It emerged from a society trying to solve a problem it did not fully understand. Mental illness, social instability, human suffering that resisted easy explanation. Faced with uncertainty, society chose structure, order, containment. And over time, those choices became institutions. Solid, permanent, seemingly unquestionable. Until they were. How care becomes control. The most unsettling lesson of the asylum era is not found in its architecture, or its medical practices, or even its most extreme moments of neglect. It is found in something quieter, something more gradual. The way care can slowly become control. At first, the intention is protection. To provide safety. To offer treatment. To create a place where those in distress can recover. But systems grow. Rules multiply. Efficiency becomes necessary. Decisions are made for large numbers of people at once. And in that process, something begins to shift. Individual voices become harder to hear. Personal experiences become categories. Human complexity becomes simplified into manageable forms. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the system begins to prioritize order over understanding. Containment over connection. Control over compassion. Not through a single decision, but through countless small ones. Each one reasonable on its own. Until the outcome becomes something no one originally intended. The language that hides suffering. Another part of this transformation lies in language. Official language. Medical language. Administrative language. The words used to describe patients, conditions, and outcomes. Within the asylum system, suffering was often translated into terms that felt precise. Clinical. Objective. A person in distress became a diagnosis. A life became a case. A voice became a symptom. This language served a purpose. It allowed doctors to communicate, to categorize, to treat. But it also created distance. Between observer and experience. Between record and reality. Because behind every diagnosis was a person whose story could never be fully captured in a file. And when language becomes too distant, too abstract, it can quietly hide the emotional truth of what is happening, making suffering easier to manage, but harder to truly see. Lives that disappeared. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the asylum era is how many lives passed through it without leaving a clear trace. People admitted during moments of crisis. People who never returned home. People whose families lost contact over time. People buried in institutional grounds, sometimes without markers. Their names recorded. Their existence acknowledged. But their stories largely unknown. They lived. They experienced. They endured. And then they became part of a system that gradually absorbed them. Until history remembered the institution more clearly than the individuals within it. The ruins as questions. Today, the remains of these asylums stand in various states of decay or transformation. Some have been repurposed, converted into homes, offices, or hospitals. Others have been demolished entirely, erased from the landscape. And some still stand, partially collapsed, slowly returning to the earth. But whether preserved or gone, their meaning remains. These buildings are not just ruins. They are questions. Questions about how societies respond to vulnerability. Questions about the balance between care and control. Questions about what happens when systems grow too large to see the individuals inside them. And perhaps most importantly, questions about whether the lessons of the past have truly been learned. The true haunting. Standing in the darkness of an abandoned asylum, it is easy to feel a sense of unease. To imagine that something lingers. Something unseen. Something waiting. But the deepest unease does not come from the possibility of ghosts. It comes from recognition. The recognition that everything that happened here was once considered normal, accepted, necessary, even humane. And that realization changes how we see the present, because it reminds us that systems do not always appear harmful while they are being built. They become harmful slowly, quietly, under the surface of good intentions. The true haunting of the asylum is not supernatural. It is historical. It is the awareness that thousands of lives unfolded behind these walls, in ways that can never be fully reconstructed, and that many of those lives were shaped by decisions made far beyond their control. Closing the documentary. The corridors are empty now. The ward silent. The doors open, yet still somehow closed. The world has moved on. The buildings have faded. But the questions remain. Because the darkest thing about British asylums was never the ghosts people imagined, but the people history tried to forget. And in those silent corridors, what lingers most is not madness, but memory. The building is quiet now. Not peaceful. Not safe. Just quiet. Because long after the doors were locked and the lights were turned off, the stories never truly left. Every file was closed. Every ward was sealed. Every voice was recorded. But some truths were never written down. And some evidence was never meant to be found. Because this case was not the only one. There are more files, more stories, more places where history left something behind, more corridors where footsteps once echoed, more rooms where silence still lingers, more records waiting to be opened. And the next one is even darker. So continue the investigation. Stay with the evidence. Because the truth doesn't disappear. It waits.